how early and how apparently effortlessly typically developing children acquire and start using language, it would be rational to assume that this must be a fairly straightforward process. But it is deceptively challenging. Infants, of course, when they're first born, they don't have any language, and they're born into a world that is rich with language. They are absolutely immersed in language. And of course, they don't know the meanings of any of the words that they're hearing. And the meanings of words are culturally specified. It's not the case that you can simply map any given word to any given referent. Otherwise, we'd all have different meanings for the same words and wouldn't be able to communicate properly. So the challenge faced by children is identifying what words go with what reference when there are potentially innumerable potential referents out there in the environment. They have to narrow their attention down to the correct ones. And this challenge was beautifully illustrated by Quinn in 1960 with what's now famously known as the Gavagai problem. So imagine that you're an explorer visiting a foreign country for the first time, and you're communicating with a native. And whilst you're conversing, they point into a field and they say the word Gavagai. And you follow their point and you see a bunny rabbit running through the field. So what does the word Gavagai refer to? Well, your first instinct might be to think, well, it refers to the bunny rabbit. And indeed, that will be a logical and plausible answer to this solution, to this problem. But Gavagai could refer to lots of different things. It could refer to the bunny, but it could refer to running. It could refer to furry, brown. It could refer to food, or it could refer to the field or any other potential referent in this visual scene. It's really difficult to know. Unfortunately, children bring to bear a range of strategies and heuristics that can help them solve the problem of referential ambiguity in word learning. So the process begins, having identified a new word in a speech stream, it begins with identifying the word's meaning. And this can occur over different timescales. It can occur sometimes in the context of the naming event. The moment the word is heard, sometimes it's possible to utilize social cues and environmental cues to figure out accurately the word's meaning. And this is called fast mapping. But sometimes fast mapping is not possible, and disambiguation of word meaning has to take place over time, over multiple occurrences and encounters with the word. And this is called cross-situational mapping. And either of these two routes results in the formation of a word-referent relationship, the first stage in word learning. Now, one way in which typically developing children get to the bottom of referential ambiguity that helps them identify the meanings of unfamiliar words is through the use of social cues. Speakers often orientate themselves towards the things that they're talking about, and typically developing children are very sensitive to where people are looking. They develop the ability to follow gaze, gestures, affect, engage in joint attention very early on in development, and they spontaneously refer to these cues when they hear people speaking, and consequently they tend to map unfamiliar words onto the objects that are the focus of a speaker's attention. This was classically illustrated in a study by Baldwin in 1993, where an experimenter and a child both held unfamiliar novel objects. Now, the experimenter waited until the child was looking at the child's object before looking down at their own object and issuing it a novel label, Modi, for example. Then the child was tasked with identifying the referent of this novel word, which is the Modi. And across the sample of typically developing children, it was reliably shown that they spontaneously consulted the speaker's direction of gaze and mapped the novel word onto the experimenter's object, rather than the object that they themselves were holding at the time and were looking at when they heard the word. They knew that it was important to consult the speaker's referential intent. Now, another way that typically developing children identify word meanings is through their understanding of how language works. Their mapping is guided by linguistic assumptions. So they use their existing knowledge of words that they have in their vocabulary, and this can help them figure out the meanings of other words. And one of these linguistic assumptions is called mutual exclusivity. And it's the principle that one word goes with one object. And they use this principle to assign novel words to unfamiliar objects when they appear alongside objects that are familiar that they already know names for. So in this example, on this slide, imagine a very strange situation where a child sees these three animals and they hear the phrase, "Look, an okapi." So the challenge faced by the child is, what is an okapi? Well, they know that it's not the animal on the left because that's a cat. And if it's a cat, it can't therefore also be an okapi. They know it's not the animal on the right because that's a dog. And if it's a dog, it can't be an okapi. So through process of elimination and the use of mutual exclusivity, children are able to narrow down their attention to the correct intended referent and map okapi to the only unfamiliar object that's present in the scene. But some word learning situations are highly ambiguous, and it's impossible to accurately fast map due to the absence of social cues or environmental cues that can help them figure out word meanings. So in this example, we're presented with two unfamiliar objects, and we hear the word blicket. So which is the blicket? Well, we haven't got enough information to answer that question accurately. Either of them could be the blicket. You may have a feeling about which one's the blicket if you make inferences based on sound symbolism, but we don't know reliably. Then we encounter another pair of objects, the same pair that we've seen before, but this time we hear the word zephyr. Now, both of these objects are already associated with the word blicket, and there's still nothing to separate them. They both, conceivably, could be a zephyr. Then we encounter a third pair. One of these objects we've seen before, and one of them is brand new, and we hear the word blicket again. Now, if we've been keeping track of the co-occurrences between words and objects, we can use those statistical correspondences to accurately infer that the green spiky object is the blicket. And the red object that we see previously, that must have been the zephyr. And the yellow object, we don't know the name for that. And this is exactly how typically developing children get to the bottom of identifying unfamiliar word meanings in these individually ambiguous situations. From 8 months of age, typically developing children are really good at tracking cross-situational statistics between words and objects, and can use these cross-situational statistics to accurately, reliably map word-referent pairings. So this leads us to the question, having identified accurately what a word means, the object that it might refer to, does mapping equal learning? Have we retained the word? Is the word now in our vocabulary, enabling later retrieval when we hear it again? Well, the answer is no. Extensive research with typically developing 2-year-olds demonstrates that they often forget new words just 5 minutes after identifying their meanings. Typically developing children, toddlers, are very, very good. They can perform almost 100% accuracy on a fast mapping task involving social cues or mutual exclusivity, but then you test them on their meanings 5 minutes later, and it's as if they're guessing, as if they've never encountered these words before. And what that tells us is that figuring out what a word means in the moment that it's heard is not sufficient for long-term learning, and therefore retention must be underpinned by a different psychological mechanism. Now, word learning and flexible use of language in general also involves generalization of words across contexts to previously unseen and unlabeled reference. If we had to hear words associated with their reference every time we heard them, language learning would take ages, and we would be unable to infer the meanings of objects that we've never seen before. We wouldn't know what their names were. And of course, that isn't how language works. Children are very good at guessing the names of objects that they haven't heard labeled through rules governing generalization. Now, many of the words that children first acquire in their vocabularies are basic nouns that refer to categories. And these categories, these words, they don't just refer to a specific exemplar, but they refer to groups of things. So for example, the word dog might first be learned in association with the family pet at home, but the child needs to learn that dog doesn't just refer to their family pet at home, but it refers to lots of other different exemplars out in the world that have certain similarities, but also they're very visually distinct. And the child's challenge is to identify the visual cues that determine category membership, whilst not really paying attention to the cues that are category irrelevant. And the cue that is most important that children end up paying most attention to, of course, is shape. The shape of something determines what it is, what the object is, and therefore what the label it should receive. Now, by 24 months of age, roughly, children develop another lexical heuristic called the shape bias. And this then governs their generalization of words and unfamiliar words that they acquire newly into their vocabulary. And the shape bias unfolds and develops in a sequence of steps. At step one, it begins with the child mapping the same word onto multiple different exemplars of an object category. So they might map the word ball to a red ball, to a blue ball, to a green ball. Then, as they map more and more objects to the same word, they come to realize similarities across those objects. Balls are round, cups are cup-shaped. And as they realize the similarity across members of more and more categories, they infer a general rule. X's are X-shaped. And once this general rule has been applied, they can utilize this rule when learning the names of unfamiliar things that they encounter for the first time. So for example, if the child goes to the zoo and they hear the word giraffe and they correctly map it to a giraffe, and then they immediately turn around and they see a stall selling plush toy giraffes, they can spontaneously extend the word giraffe to the plush toy because it matches on shape, even though it might differ in color and it differs on size. And as I said, children develop this shape bias around 24 months of age, or when they've acquired about 50 to 100 concrete nouns in their vocabulary. So the process of acquiring and learning object names tunes children's attention, their visual attention, to pay attention specifically to shape.